Throughout human history, our survival, growth, and progress have always been tied to one thing: food. The first great civilizations of the world, Sumer in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley, and South Asia, all flourished because they mastered agriculture. They understood the rhythm of rain, the power of rivers, and the necessity of fertile land. But history also remembers when that balance was broken. When rains failed, rivers dried, or floods came too often. These same civilizations withered and died. Food has always been both our strength and our vulnerability. For over 10,000 years, human civilization has rested on one silent but foundational truth. Agriculture depends on climate, and civilization depends on agriculture. The rise of every great empire, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from China to the Americas, was made possible by the miracle of consistent weather, reliable rainfall, and predictable season. Climate stability gave humans a chance to stop wandering and start building. It gave them the opportunity to grow food, settle in one place, feed growing populations, and develop trade, language, culture, and laws. But every time that climatic balance was lost, whether slowly or suddenly, societies crumbled. We often credit military power, architecture, or politics for the glory of civilizations, but strip away the food supply, and even the greatest societies unravel. The ancient Sumerians were some of the first to harness irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their cities flourished because they could reliably feed their people. But when those rivers became unpredictable, flooding one year, drying up the next, their ability to grow crops collapsed. Famine followed, rebellions grew. The once great civilization that gave us writing and law disintegrated into history. In Egypt, the Nile was everything. For centuries, it flooded on schedule, depositing rich silt across farmlands. But when changes in climate disrupted this sacred rhythm, it triggered widespread food shortages. Famines in ancient Egypt were not just agricultural failures. They were national emergencies that led to civil unrest, economic breakdown, and eventually, the weakening of the pharaoh's divine authority. Even an empire as seemingly eternal as Egypt was vulnerable to the whims of nature. This pattern repeated itself across continents and centuries. In Mesoamerica, the Mayans reached astronomical heights in mathematics, architecture, and urban planning. But their fate changed as multi-decade droughts devastated their region. Deforestation and overfarming had already stretched their resources thin. When the rains stopped, cities that once teemed with life were abandoned. The jungle swallowed stone temples whole. What was once one of the world's most advanced civilizations collapsed not with an invasion, but with a change in weather. The story of Angkor Wat in Southeast Asia is just as telling. The Khmer Empire's mastery of water through vast reservoirs and canals made it a superpower. But climate shifts, intense monsoons followed by deep droughts, overwhelmed their infrastructure. Their system of water control failed. Crops were destroyed. Their grand temples remain today, but the people who built them were scattered by hunger and chaos. Even in Europe, the Great Famine of 1315-1317 reveals how vulnerable humanity remains to environmental shifts. Unusual rains and cold weather ruined crops for 3 straight years. Millions starved and society reeled. This wasn't in the distant past. This was just 700 years ago, long after the development of kings, knights, castles, and cathedrals. No matter how advanced a society may appear, its prosperity still leans on the delicate thread of climate stability. More recently, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the United States showed that even in the modern industrial era, ecological mismanagement and environmental stress can devastate entire regions. Overfarming, combined with drought and high winds, turned fertile land into a wasteland. Hundreds of thousands of Americans became climate migrants, leaving their homes and farms behind in search of survival. This wasn't a story from the ancient world. It was just 90 years ago, in one of the wealthiest countries on Earth. The truth has never changed. Stable climate means stable food, means a stable food, means a stable society. When crops fail, panic sets in. Prices soar, children go hungry. Political unrest grows. Wars start. People flee. We may live in cities of steel and glass today, but our roots are still planted in the soil. and the soil answers only to nature. The danger now is even greater. Climate change today is not a seasonal fluctuation. It's not regional. It is global, accelerating, and human-driven. We are shifting the planet's temperature faster than ever recorded in history. And just as history shows, when the rains fail or the heat scorches, the consequences are not just agricultural, they're civilizational. Understanding this historical truth is not about fear, it is about clarity. The societies that thrived understood their environment and respected it. The ones that ignored it vanished. Today we face the same test, and if we want to pass it, we must act with the wisdom that history demands. Because the collapse of climate means the collapse of food, and when food goes, civilization follows. Always has, always will, unless we choose a different ending. Take the Akkadian Empire, one of the world's earliest. Around 4,200 years ago, they faced a devastating climate event. A 300-year drought. Their empire crumbled not because they were weak, but because nature starved their crops and silenced their trade. The mighty Mayans, whose cities towered in Central America, collapsed in part due to long-term droughts that made it impossible to feed their people. Angkor Wat, once the jewel of Southeast Asia, fell when monsoons became erratic, disrupting food production. Time and again, we've seen how environmental changes ripple through economies, cultures, and political structures. Throughout history, food has been more than just sustenance. It has been the foundation of peace, prosperity, and power. Empires were not only built by swords or trade, but by the ability to nourish their people. And time and again, the fall of great powers has been triggered not by invading armies, but by the invisible hand of famine. When crops fail, when bellies go empty, the mighty begin to tremble. Take the Roman Empire, for example. At its height, Rome ruled over vast lands, controlled the Mediterranean, and boasted one of the most sophisticated infrastructures of the ancient world. But even Rome could not outrun nature. During the decline of the Western Roman Empire, climate instability played a profound role. Droughts, coupled with colder temperatures during what historians now call the late antique Little Ice Age, reduced agricultural yields. Harvests shrank, food prices soared. In response, peasants fled the countryside, military campaigns faltered, and social unrest exploded. When Rome could no longer feed its cities, its citizens lost faith in the empire's ability to lead. Barbarians may have delivered the final blow, but hunger had already weakened the walls. The empire that once brought grain from Egypt to feed its people crumbled when those same supplies ran dry. It wasn't just the sword that destroyed Rome, it was the scythe's failure. Fast forward a millennium to Ireland in the mid-19th century. The Irish potato famine was not merely a tragedy. It was a monumental turning point in the history of Western civilization. For years, the Irish population had become dangerously dependent on a single crop, the potato. When a fungal disease known as potato blight struck in 1845, the consequences were catastrophic. Over 1 million people died from starvation and disease. Another 1 million fled the country, many of them to the United States. But this famine didn't just decimate Ireland's population. It ignited political revolts, intensified anti-British sentiment, and shifted global migration patterns permanently. The echoes of that food crisis are still heard today in Irish politics, identity, and diaspora. All of this again began with failed crops. Evidence that food insecurity is never just a hunger issue. It is a political, economic, and human catastrophe. In both Rome and Ireland, these collapses were not caused solely by the environment, but rather by a system's failure to respond. Rome didn't adapt fast enough to changing weather. Ireland's leadership failed to diversify agriculture and provide relief. When leaders ignore the warnings that come with failing crops, they are not simply facing a temporary food shortage. They're gambling with the destiny of nations. And we must not forget that in every one of these cases, the people suffered first. Ordinary citizens paid the price for elite mismanagement. This has always been true. In any crisis of food, those with power may survive, but it's the poor, the farmers, the children, and the workers who suffer the most. These are not ancient stories. They are warnings. Climate change today is setting the stage for similar scenarios, not in one nation but across the globe. Desertification in Africa, floods in South Asia, drought in the American West, and melting glaciers in the Andes. Each region is feeling the early tremors of food insecurity. If history has taught us anything, it's that these tremors do not remain small. They build into quakes that shake societies to their foundations. We live in an age of high-tech agriculture, yes, but we also live in a world that is deeply interconnected and fragile. A failed crop in one country can send prices soaring in another. Food security is global security. And history tells us that when it falters, even the strongest empires can fall. In the 14th century, before the plague devastated Europe, it was the Great Famine that weakened the population. Crops failed across the continent due to years of cold and rain. Climate irregularities we now know were part of the Little Ice Age. Millions died. And in more recent history, the 1930s Dust Bowl in the United States stands as a brutal reminder of how ecological mismanagement and climate can collide. Farmers lost their land, families migrated, and hunger spread, all because the earth could no longer sustain what humans demanded of it. The Green Revolution of the 20th century is often remembered as one of humanity's most triumphant responses to the threat of mass starvation. In the decades following World War II, countries across the globe stood at the edge of a terrifying future. The population was booming, and food production couldn't keep pace. Scientists, policymakers, and farmers feared a global famine that could devastate entire continents. Yet through innovation, science, and cooperation, humanity pushed back against that fate. It was not just a scientific milestone, it was a collective act of survival, a testament to what we can achieve when food security becomes a shared mission. The revolution began quietly, with seeds. Scientists like Norman Borlaug, who would later be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, developed high-yield, disease-resistant varieties of wheat, rice, and maize. These crops weren't ordinary. They were the product of thousands of hours of research, experimentation, and determination. With them came new farming techniques, from synthetic fertilizers to irrigation systems to mechanized tools that transformed agriculture from a fragile gamble into a more stable science. India, once plagued by deadly famines, became one of the first major test cases. In the 1960s, the country was on the verge of collapse. Food aid shipments from abroad were barely keeping millions alive. But when Green Revolution technologies were introduced, first in test fields and then across whole regions, yields doubled and tripled. For the first time in its modern history, India achieved self-sufficiency in food production. Grain stockpiles grew, starvation declined, the specter of famine faded into memory. Other nations followed suit. Mexico, Pakistan, the Philippines, and China all adopted similar methods, leading to a dramatic rise in global food output. Between 1960 and 2000, the world's population more than doubled, but food production more than kept up. Caloric intake rose in many developing nations, life expectancy improved, and childhood malnutrition began to drop. This was not a miracle. It was the result of intentional global coordination to stop hunger before it could trigger widespread instability. But the story of the Green Revolution is not just a celebration. It is also a reminder. It tells us that food crises are solvable, but only if we treat them as urgent, shared threats. The world didn't wait for a collapse before it acted. Governments funded research. Farmers took risks. The public supported change. That spirit of urgency and innovation is exactly what the climate crisis demands of us now. Climate change is unraveling many of the gains made during the Green Revolution. In some regions, the very seeds that once brought salvation are now wilting under extreme heat, erratic rainfall, and spreading pests. The fertilizers that once nourished the land are now polluting rivers and degrading soil. Groundwater used for irrigation is disappearing faster than it can be replenished. What was once a solution is becoming, in many ways, a new source of vulnerability. And yet the legacy of the Green Revolution offers hope. Not because it was perfect, but because it proved we can overcome enormous challenges when we treat food security as a global imperative. We need a new kind of revolution now, a climate-smart one. One that embraces agroecology, invests in drought-resistant seeds, empowers smallholder farmers, and uses technology wisely. One that doesn't just grow more food, but grows food in harmony with the earth. History teaches us that food security is never guaranteed. It must be defended by science, by policy, by cooperation, and by moral will. When we remember how close the world came to collapse in the 1960s and how it chose to rise through innovation and unity, we are reminded that we've beaten the odds before. We can do it again, but we must act quickly. Climate change is not waiting. Crops are failing today, seas are rising now, and hunger is already returning to places once thought safe. The time for passive observation is over. The story of the Green Revolution should not be a nostalgic tale of the past. It should be a call to arms for our future. Because food is not just a necessity, it is a right, a foundation, a promise we must keep for every child in every nation for generations to come. Today, we face a far more complex crisis. Climate change is not temporary and it's not regional. It's global, relentless, and it is targeting the very foundation of our food systems. Rising temperatures are drying out farmlands across Africa and South Asia. Rainfall patterns are shifting in South America, destroying harvest cycles. Coastal regions around the world, once thriving with fisheries, now face ocean acidification and rising sea levels. Floods drown crops, fires scorch fields, and the most vulnerable small farmers, rural families, and low-income nations are hit first and hardest. In the heart of America during the 1930s, a disaster unfolded that no war or foreign power could have caused. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a weather anomaly. It was a powerful lesson in what happens when human ambition ignores nature's balance. This dark chapter in US history serves as a powerful reminder. When we take the environment for granted, it can take everything from us in return. Farmers across the Great Plains have been encouraged to till every inch of the land. Technological advancement in plowing equipment allowed for massive expansion of farmland. For a while, it worked. Wheat production soared and profits followed. But the ecological consequences were devastating. The native grasses that once anchored the soil were ripped away. The earth, once living and rich, became exposed and vulnerable. Then came the drought. Year after year, the rains stopped. The skies turned blue and empty. The once fertile plains dried out and cracked open. Without grasses to hold the soil together, powerful winds swept across the land, lifting millions of tons of dirt into the sky. Black clouds of dust blotted out the sun. Crops failed. Livestock died. Families choked in their homes as dust blew through windows and doors. This wasn't some far-flung village. It was Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas. It was the heartland of a global superpower. Yet the nation was brought low by a silent, choking force. Bad land management combined with climate extremes, over 3 million people were displaced. They became known as a Dust Bowl refugees, wandering from town to town in search of work, food, and shelter. Their stories, immortalized in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, reflect the deep suffering caused not by enemy armies but by environmental collapse. And it wasn't just about dust. It was about economic ruin, family separations, suicide, hunger, and hopelessness. That's what food insecurity looks like when nature turns its back. But this chapter also taught resilience. The government eventually responded with soil conservation programs, reforestation, and new farming techniques that respected the land's limitations. People adapted, learned, and fought their way back. That's the spirit we need today. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a story of loss. It was a lesson about arrogance and humility. We learned that technological power means nothing if it's not aligned with environmental wisdom. We learned that no country, no matter how advanced, is immune from nature's wrath. Today, as climate change accelerates, we are beginning to see the early warning signs of newer dust bowls around the world. From California to China, from Brazil to Sudan. If we do not heed the lessons of the past, we risk repeating them. Because no wall, no wealth, and no war machine can protect a nation that cannot feed its people. The Dust Bowl was our warning. Let's make it our turning point, not our future. But this is not just a warning from the past. It is a call to action for the present. Our ancestors didn't have the science, the technology, or the global cooperation that we have today. We do, and that gives us an edge they never had. We can build resilient agriculture. We can invest in drought-resistant crops, smart irrigation, and green technology. We can cut emissions, preserve water, and protect our forests. We can work across borders to secure food for all, not just for today, but for generations to come. Throughout human history, empires have risen and fallen not only by the strength of their armies or the wealth of their treasuries, but by the ability to feed their people. The Roman Empire's greatness was fed by a vast network of grain from Egypt. The Islamic Golden Age thrived on agricultural innovations that turned arid lands into fertile fields. The Industrial Revolution in Europe was made possible in part by advances in crop rotation and mechanization that freed up labor and ensured a steady supply of food for growing cities. In each of these moments, food security wasn't just an agricultural concern, it was the backbone of civilization itself. Yet today, this ancient truth is being challenged like never before. Climate change is steadily shaking the very foundations of global food supply chains. Once predictable weather patterns have given way to chaos. Droughts scorch fields for months, and then relentless floods sweep away entire harvests. Deserts are expanding. Coastal farmland is vanishing under rising seas. Insects that once lived in tropical zones are invading temperate fields, bringing new diseases to crops that have no defense. And behind it all stands a question the world is only beginning to reckon with. How do we feed humanity in an age of planetary disruption? The ripple effects of climate instability are global and deeply intertwined. A heatwave in India doesn't stay in India. It affects rice exports and causes price hikes in Africa. Drought in California impacts almond and vegetable prices in Europe. Flooding in Bangladesh disrupts the garment industry, which in turn reduces income for families who now can't afford staple foods. It's a chain reaction, and every link in that chain matters. We live in a world where over 820 million people still go to bed hungry, and where nearly 2 billion suffer from food insecurity. Climate change is not creating this crisis, it is accelerating it, amplifying the risks and pushing millions closer to the edge. And it is disproportionately affecting those who are least responsible for the emissions that caused it. Subsistence farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, fishermen in Southeast Asia, pastoralists in Central Asia, these communities are the frontline victims of a global crisis that they did not create. But this isn't just a humanitarian issue. It is a threat to peace and stability. History shows that food insecurity leads to social unrest, migration, and conflict. The Arab Spring, which reshaped the Middle East, was sparked in part by skyrocketing food prices. Civil wars in places like Syria and Sudan have roots in drought and crop failure. When people are hungry, when they watch their livelihoods wither, they protest, they flee, they fight. And no nation is immune from the consequences. What makes this moment both dangerous and promising is that we now understand the science. We have the data. We can forecast droughts, model sea level rise, and track soil degradation. This knowledge is power, but only if we act on it. We need climate-resilient agriculture that can withstand heat, wind, and flood. We need to invest in local food systems that reduce dependency on fragile global chains. We need to reduce food waste, which currently accounts for nearly 1/3 of all food produced, while millions still starve. We need to support indigenous and traditional farming methods that have fed people for centuries and are often more sustainable than industrial agriculture. We must also remember the ethics of this challenge. It is not enough to engineer new crops or build walls to keep out climate refugees. We need justice. Climate justice means acknowledging that those with the least resources need the most support. It means fair access to water, land, and seeds. It means empowering women farmers who produce much of the food in developing countries but often lack land rights or financial services. It means using wealth and technology to lift people up, not shut them out. In the face of crisis, the choices we make now will determine the legacy we leave behind. Will future generations say we saw the threat and ignored it? Or will they say we rose with courage, with vision, with compassion? The great civilizations of history understood the central role of food in human destiny. Now it is our turn to carry that wisdom forward. We must meet this challenge not with fear, but with a bold determination that food security for all is not a dream, it is a duty. Let us not be remembered as the generation that saw disaster coming and did nothing. Let us be the ones who stood up, who remembered the lessons of history, and who reshaped the future. Because the truth is simple. When food vanishes, civilizations fall. But when hope, science, and courage rise, so can we. From the beginning of agriculture over 10,000 years ago, human civilization has relied on a delicate balance with nature to feed itself. Will we allow the lessons of history to guide us toward compassion and courage, or will we repeat the cycles of collapse with greater consequences than ever before? The choice is ours, and the time is now. We cannot afford complacency, because the soil beneath our feet, the rain in our skies, and the seeds in our hands are calling for urgent and unified action. Let us rise to meet that call, not only to protect ourselves, but to ensure that future generations inherit a planet where food is not a privilege, but a guarantee.